thank you and welcome. I have the privilege of chairing the first panel today with the title of Terrorism, the Evolution of a Field of Study. And we have two esteemed speakers, Professor Emeritus Alex Schmidt and Dr. Lisa Stepnitsky, and they'll each have 30 minutes to speak before I hand it over to Dr. Kieran McConaughey, for his discussant remarks. And then we'll open it up to the panel, or to the floor, sorry, for discussion, not to the panel for discussion. And if we could begin with Professor Alex Schmidt. 30. I'll give you a flag.
Good morning, everybody. It's sure good to be back here in Salvators. Last time I was here 5 years ago, we were in the arts building. Now we are in the more ancient halls. CSTPV actually started in the corner of this building many years ago when I first visited Paul. I'm talking about a wicked problem that many people think is quite boring, talking about definitions, but that's how it is. Because if you can't define what you're talking about, how can we have a theory? How can we progress? So one of the problems we in the social sciences have is that our everyday language, our social scientific language is more or less the same. So politicians, the media, and we have to share that. Physics is in a much better position worldwide. They have one language, it's called mathematics. It's beyond my horizon, but I understand that this also a lot of problems. So one of the problems we have is that terms are used to stigmatize people. They're toxic terms like anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, racist, and terrorist also belongs to that. These terms can kill. We see this at the moment, how certain Kurdish groups in Syria are termed terrorist by certain NATO partners and therefore become targets of anti-terrorism, while they were the most successful anti-terrorists themselves in recent times. So I said it is a boring subject, but it's a subject that doesn't let you go. If you go to the website Academia Edu, the social networking website for academics with nearly 100 million users, listening 23 million scholarly papers, you can find 11,000 papers that have the definition of terrorism in the title of the paper, another 100,000 that deal with the subject in the text. And if you go outside academia, outside the ivory tower, and hit Google search, you get 155 million entries. So how can I summarize all that thinking that's going on this problem that is a wicked problem because it's resistant to resolution? And this, I think, is due to several factors. I will list to you half a dozen. The first factor that makes it difficult is that terrorism is a complex problem. My late friend and mentor Ted Gurr and his colleague Monty Marshall described it in these terms that gives you an idea about the space that the term terrorism stretches. A second problem is that the terms terror and terrorism are taken by some to be more or less synonymous, like in the global war on terror. Some scholars use terror for state terrorism and terrorism for the non-state variant. So we have problems here too. Well, there's a lot of writing on terrorism, on terror, the raw fear that generates the terrorism is not so well covered. I said that terrorism is a complex problem, but in a way, the basic mechanism is quite simple. There's a terrorist, there's a victim, and there are targets. Well, with a normal assassination, the victim is the target. With a terrorist assassination, it's not like that. And the way the victim is victimized in the presence of witnesses or mass communication media makes that the terrorism gets its power. Otherwise it would be like a tree falling in the forest with no forester and press watching the whole thing. Yet another source of confusion is that not everybody is terrorized by terrorism. There's a whole scale of reaction, depending whether you identify with the victim, with the government, or with the perpetrator. You get very different reactions. Reactions 7 to 10, for instance, were quite widespread in parts of the Arab and Muslim world after 9/11. There were people jubilating about these events. Yet another problem is there are many conflict parties, many audiences involved in the terrorism business. These are all ultimate secondary targets. And of course, the media are the ones that amplify, magnify the whole event. When I first wrote a handbook on terrorism, I identified 22 different purposes based on what I gathered from the literature of the terrorists themselves, why they did it. So it's a multi-purpose tool. And another source of confusion is, and that's perhaps one of the major ones, that all political violence is equated with terrorism, while it's not. I mean, in the past, for instance, in the British definition, government definition from 1974, terrorism was simply described in terms of violence for political ends, but that is in a way circular. But there are many forms of political violence that are different from terrorism. Some of them overlap, like assassination. Once assassination becomes serial, then the terrorist effect emerges. Statis Kalivas has recently identified 12 different forms of political violence. I have in this list, which is a bit older, more. Yet another source of confusion is that there are not only a lot of forms of political violence other than terrorism, there are also many terrorisms. In a typology I developed in the early 1980s, I came up with 12 different forms, not all of them political. Some of the forms I labeled like single issue terrorism stuck, others were already existent. To my shame, I have to confess that in my first version, I forgot religious terrorism. In 1980, it was not such a big thing. Only in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and the Afghan intervention did religious terrorism take such a flight. But actually, when I look at the more recent typologies, I find that new categories have been added. I would not call them all types of terrorism. There are varieties. Sometimes, for instance, there is literature on agro-terrorism. I've never seen a case of agro-terrorism. What we hear a lot about, and I was at a UN conference earlier this year for CTET, was cyber terrorism. It's also something I have problems with. Of course, terrorists, like everybody else, uses the internet and computers. So the role of communication is crucial, but a number of things are missing in what is now termed cyber terrorism. More often than not, it is governments that engage in it. More often than not, it's anonymous and not claimed, though normal terrorism is, strange enough, also not claimed in all cases. I think the Global Counterterrorism Database of START still listed about a third of the incidents without really who is behind it. But there one could, sometimes there are false flag operations and all sorts of things. So yes, I would challenge those who call cyber terrorism terrorism. But these are just some of the problems I see. 5 years ago I was talking about the same subject and I came to a number of conclusions, and today I would like to continue that discussion. And before I go into the future, let me go into the past when it all began. There was in 1792 a sudden panic in Paris, and fear raged through the city, and a year later that natural fear arose, was sort of instrumentalized by Maximilien de Robespierre and his Committee of Public Health, Salut Public, and they started to place a guillotine on the place where now in front of the Louvre you have this beautiful glass pyramid, and started beheading people, a couple of thousand, not more. But the effect of that was tremendous. At that time, it was clearly a thing that the government did. But the idea was picked up in the 19th century by national liberation movements and social revolutionary movement and anarchist movement, and gained strength when two things combined: the invention of dynamite in the 1860s and the perfection of the rotary press. So they started soon to interact, and that interaction has gone on in ever bigger ways. And if you look at a couple of the modern terrorists and the role they attribute to the media, half of the battlefield is in the media, Salvators said. But I would like to draw your attention to the second quote here, because it perfectly illustrates that triangle, that the ultimate target were not the people in the World Trade Center or even in Washington, D.C. It was the Arab silent masses that they wanted to wake up. And that is the core of the terrorist strategy. What we call terrorism is linked to who has definition power. And as things are in the world, it's rarely the victims. So let me go through a couple of groups, stakeholders that have or claim to have definition power, to begin with the terrorists themselves. Here is a statement from the first modern type terrorist group, Naya Volya, heavily dominated by women who were both intellectuals and terrorist conspirators in Tsarist Russia. And that is one of the first descriptions of the terrorist tactic that you see here. It has several purposes, as you see in the second part of the statement, but it already illustrates what later would become a more elaborate and sophisticated strategy. The second possible definer after the terrorists themselves are, of course, lexica, encyclopedias. And I picked from the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences from 1936 this quote, which is already bringing us closer to our modern day understanding of the phenomenon. It was also the period when the League of Nations started to try to define the subject. A convention was drafted, but only ratified by India, and then came World War II, and the thing was forgotten for a while. But the strange thing, both in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences and in the League of Nations definition, the victim was the government, not the perpetrator, not fascism or communism, which were the big perpetrators. Think of Stalin's show trials. That linking or relinking of terrorism to state actors occurred only after the Second World War, when fascism was defeated and communism was contained and hot in Korea. And Hannah Arendt, Jewish scholar, came up with this particular description of state terrorism. Of course, these descriptions are not definitions in a technical sense, but it gives the substance of the thinking about terrorism as she saw it. And she saw the Russian practice as even more refined. And if you look at some of the KGB documents from the time, they even talk about terrorism without violence, when merely showing some old movies about victimizations were enough to recall the terror and horror of the time. After the 50s, with its national liberation wars, there was a lot of interest in counterinsurgency, and one of the classical studies of that came from nobody else than Martha Crenshaw, who studied the Algerian War of Independence, 1954-1962, and she came up with this very precise description of revolutionary terrorism. Especially point 4, the revolutionary movement deliberately intends these actions, which she called politically unacceptable violence, to create a psychological effect on specific groups and thereby to change their political behavior and attitudes. So we are getting closer and closer to that understanding. 1972 was also the year when we saw this attack on the Munich Olympic Games, where 13 athletes were killed by a Palestinian commando, and the world was watching on 800 million TV screens, almost live, what was going on. This inspired, the same year, Brian Jenkins from RAND, a Vietnam veteran turned scholar, to identify terrorism as theater. Later, in the 21st century, he qualified the last sentence: terrorism is violence aimed at the people watching. It is also aimed at killing, he qualified. But the basic structure that we see in terrorism clearer and clearer comes out here. Strange enough, it took quite a bit of time until religion was beginning to be seen as problematic and in some ways feeding into terrorism. If we go to the NATO definition of 2003, which basically reflects, like so many other things in NATO, US Army manual definitions, you find here that in addition to political and ideological objectives, religious objectives are also mentioned. The definition game that, it's not a game, it's a tragedy, but I was every year going to New York for a week to listen to the ad hoc committee on terrorism, which is a subgroup of the General Assembly's sixth legal committee, how they discussed the definition and other issues when a new convention proposed by India that was supposed to fill the holes in the existing 12 conventions at that time. In the meantime, there are 14 and there are a number of protocols as well. I went to these discussions and they came up with this definition. I was slightly disappointed because these were legal scholars mostly, and they had such wishy-washy terms like any person, any means, any act in it, terms that lend themselves to abuse if this convention is ever opened for signature and ratified. The main points discussed were actually no longer the Article 2 about the definition but were whether state actors like armies could also possibly engage in such things as terrorism, or whether national liberation movements could be called terrorists, or parties should also be excluded like Hezbollah. Especially the Islamic Conference with its more than 50 members was very much pressing certain issues and withholding others. Well, I gave you a couple of definitions, but it goes on. If you go to the national level, you come up with definitions like this one, which would turn you all into terrorists because you're either atheists like me or perhaps not quite as enthusiastic as the Saudi population is supposed to be about their rule. I just asked Jeff Kaplan, who has been with in Saudi Arabia for some time, and now he's in Pakistan actually, in Karachi, to send me the newest version of the definition. This one is a 2014 version, but he has not responded in time to inform me on that. Well, if everybody is tinkering with the definition, I also try to add my pound of wisdom. I did this several times in 3 issues of a handbook where I sent out questionnaires to hundreds of scholars, and then 7 minutes, I don't need more than that. And so I refined these definitions. First I had 22 elements in the definition, and now I'm down to 12. Of course, it would be ideal if you had just a very short formula like a terrorist is a bomber without an air force or something like that. But this is the definition from 2011. In the meantime, I have also worked on this one. But I think it goes back to the 1936 definition in some way of Hartmann, where a distinction is made between terrorism as a doctrine and terrorism as a tactic, which is a useful distinction. What I added is the 3 contexts: illegal state repression, propagandistic agitation, and a tactic of irregular warfare, which goes back to the initial PowerPoint I showed you from Ted Gurr and Monty Marshall. So you see, we try to be cumulative in our definitions, but I mean, do academic definitions matter? Look at what happened the other day with the US government stepping out of the Paris Climate Accord. There's unanimity among 11,000 climate specialists that something bad is going to happen, and the second biggest polluter in the world can easily overrule. So who has the biggest shot when it comes to definition of terrorism these days? Well, it is an organization that has 2.41 billion monthly users and has a stronger voice than everybody else. Brian Fishman has 350 specialists on terrorism at Facebook. Facebook has 15,000 content monitors, I think they're called, or content screeners. So they define terrorism. I'm glad that this new definition from September of this year includes harm to civilians, which in the older definition of Facebook was not there. Well, some people are sick of using the word terrorism, and they came up with this wonderful idea of talking about violent extremism rather than that. But how did we get at that term? It comes originally from this country, but got big in the United States, where some policymakers in the second Bush administration thought, well, maybe the global war on terror rhetoric has to be toned down a little bit. So they came up with countering violent extremism, and because some of the friends, the Saudis, were perhaps a bit extreme but not violent in their view, or the Muslim Brotherhood was no longer violent, so they made the distinction between violent and non-violent extremism. If you look at non-violence as a political science concept, you come to Gandhi, to Martin Luther King, but you don't come to the Muslim Brotherhood. But anyway, and of course, that's where the funding comes from government, so a lot of political scientists in academia also use this terminology. What is extremism? I mean, radicalism has a history of going back 200 years. It's progressive, it's Republican, it's egalitarian, it's secular. But what is extremism? Extremism, very few extremists call themselves extremists. I mean, there are terrorists who call themselves terrorists. Vera Zasulic, for instance, said when she was caught trying to kill the governor of Petersburg, she was astonished that they called her a murderer. She said, I'm not a murderer, I'm a terrorist. But anyway, we have now definitions of violent extremism, and a lot of them are not very good, but this one is a good one from John Berger that summarizes many things. But what I think we should, if we use this extremism terminology, we should have a very close look what is political moderation. And moderation has a history, and it's there in different parties. It's something that's gone out of the wind in this age of Twitter. But anyway, this is a good working definition of Berger. I also tried my hand. I was more concerned about the bad things that come from religious extremism, and like all of my definitions, they're much too detailed and too long. But the main concern these days are Salafist jihadism, and that brings me to the question, what is the relationship, 2 minutes I can do that, what's the relationship between jihadism and terrorism? Not all terrorists are jihadis, and not all jihadis are terrorists. But if you look at what goes under Salafist jihadist terrorism, suicide attacks, attacks on civilians, kidnapping, hostage-taking, bombing of churches, and so on. If you go to the international humanitarian law, you see all these things are called war crimes. So in 1992, when the UN Crime Commission asked me to go over 20 years of definitions of terrorism, I saw the confusion. I said, well, there is consensus in the international community, which is community of states, about the concept of war crimes. So why don't we just take that concept and stretch it into peacetime and call an act of terrorism a peacetime equivalent of war crime? It was not accepted. I think only the Indian Supreme Court used that in some of its rulings. Well, these were the war crimes. There is ethic in warfare, not just war theory in Christian thinking with the Troika Day and other things. And the same thing happens in mainstream Islam, though it's disputed what is mainstream Islam. Islam with the strongest voice, that would be Saudi, who have poured 200 billion into proselytizing their version of Islam. But this is from a Jordanian source, identifying what these authors think are the Islamic laws of war. Ultimately, we come to the question, what is and what isn't permitted in terms of political opposition. And among the answers I found, Stuart Hampshire from Oxford came up with this set of very narrow rules when political violence against the state can be permitted. And if you go through them, you will see that terrorism is not an option that would be. I come to the conclusion, because my time is running out, there is a price to be paid if we do not agree on what terrorism, and James Dorsey from Nanyang University in Singapore summarized it quite well when he said what I put here on this last PowerPoint. And with this, I see that my time is up, so I hope that this has not been too boring. I was afraid that because I had a bad night, I would fall asleep before you fall asleep, but it hasn't happened. Thank you.
All right, first of all, I'd like to thank Tim Wilson and the Center for inviting me today. Especially given that this center itself, as well as many of the other speakers, were important actors in the research I've done on the history of terrorism studies. It's a real honor to be invited back to speak about my research here at one of the sites where some of it all started. I'm going to speak today about the emergence of terrorism as an object of knowledge. So why study the history of terrorism expertise? I argue that this history is not simply of academic concern, but that the past of terrorism studies shapes the questions that the field faces in its present and its future, and therefore should be of concern to everyone here. My research into the history of terrorism was first sparked by my attempt to understand what was happening in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. As terrible as these attacks were, it's also true, right, that the sheer magnitude of deaths and the likelihood of harm, right, sort of thinking about terrorism as a risk, right, sort of in most years, more Americans are killed in auto accidents, by cancer, or even by drowning in a bathtub. And this is not unknown, right? This is a table that's been shared several 100,000 times on Twitter. But despite this, right, American and for the most part worldwide security policy tends to be organized not around the threat from bathtubs or lightning strikes or auto accidents, right? But rather terrorism is one of the key axes of security policy around the world today. On the other hand, right, if we look at the number of deaths resulting directly and indirectly from the war on terror itself, right, the numbers are of course contested, but some estimates range upwards of 1 million deaths in the war in Iraq alone. The significance of terrorism, therefore, cannot be derived simply from the absolute danger of, right, sort of what we call terrorism or terrorists themselves, but has to be thought about in terms of its significance deriving from the meanings that we collectively attribute to it and the responses that it calls forth as a problem. And so I begin with the assertion that terrorism is not a natural category that already exists out there in the world, but it's one that has been socially constructed. This, of course, does not mean that terrorism, right, or the acts that we call terrorism are not real. It only means that both the events that comprise terrorism and the ways that we understand them have been shaped by social and political forces. Now, what I found most puzzling in the days, weeks, and months following the 9/11 attacks was that Americans' attempts to understand what had happened seemed to boil down again and again to one question: why do they hate us? And while this question might, in theory, have been answered in lots of different ways, there seemed to be one response that proliferated above all others. And this, oddly enough, was that there were no real reasons, at least none that were rational or understandable. And so the refrains you heard over and over again were, they hate us for our freedoms. They hate us for who we are. One of my favorite illustrations of this occurred in a meeting held at the White House on September 26, 2001, when President Bush met with Muslim community leaders and, in the course of discussion, declared, "I consider bin Laden an evil man. This is a man who hates freedom. This is an evil man." He was then asked, but does he have political goals? To which the president could only reply, he has got evil goals, and it's hard to think in conventional terms about a man so dominated by evil. Public discussion of the 9/11 attacks swiftly came to be dominated by this language of evil, and alternate approaches, especially those that sought to connect the attacks to US foreign policy, were marginalized. And what seemed to me so strange, in watching this as an observer, was that there was a seeming impossibility of talking about causes at all, right? Or at least of being heard if one tried to do so. And so what I want to argue is that this aspect of the response, right, this rejection of explanation, was not just something that was a momentary response to the shock of the attacks. It wasn't just a reflexive response to being victimized by a massive act of violence. But there's a particular history here which made that response possible and precluded others. And this was not simply a matter of overt politicization or emotion taking over presidential discourses or the popular media. This same taboo on causation also deeply affected experts and the production of expert knowledge on political violence. Experts on terrorism, including academics who had devoted their careers to the study of political violence, who sought explanations for the attacks, who highlighted the need to understand the motivations of terrorism, were viewed with suspicion. So, for example, right, Professor Martha Crenshaw recalled that people in the government would feel mostly indignant. They would get upset when we said that you have to understand the motivations of terrorists. And I argue that both expert and popular discourse about terrorism have been characterized by what I call a politics of anti-knowledge, in which knowing the terrorist is prescribed. It is as though a language of evil creates a black box around the terrorist, which creates its own explanation. Terrorists commit terrorism because they're evil. And if terrorists are evil and irrational, then one cannot, perhaps even should not, seek to know anything more about them. I want to clarify, right, sort of that this is also not just a peculiarly American phenomenon. More recently, following the November 2015 attacks in Paris, then Prime Minister Manuel Valls told the French Senate that, "I'm tired of people constantly looking for excuses or cultural or sociological explanations for what happened," further declaring that to explain is to excuse. Similarly, in 2013, shortly after the Boston Marathon bombings and several smaller terrorist incidents in Canada, Prime Minister Stephen Harper denounced those who suggested we identify the root causes of terrorism, proclaiming, "When you see this type of violent act, you do not sit around trying to rationalize it or make excuses for it or figure out its root causes," declaring, "This is not a time to commit sociology." Neither Valls nor Harper's outbursts were isolated incidents. Rather, they are expressions of the same tendency to reject explanation that structured the immediate response to 9/11, a tendency that I argue has structured political debates on terrorism and political violence since the 1970s. And so I ask, how did we arrive at such a point? The conceptualization of terrorism as irrational evil was not just something that was newly introduced after 9/11. On the other hand, this is also not a timeless framing through which acts of political violence and terrorism have always been understood. Before the 1970s, hijackings, assassinations, and other acts that we would now generally call terrorism were generally considered to be the work of rational, strategic actors. But as the problem of terrorism began to take shape as an object of knowledge and to become the dominant framework through which certain types of political violence were understood, it became to be rooted in an idea of a terrorist identity. Terrorism became tied to the identity of actors. Terrorism is committed by terrorists, rather than being understanding terrorism as a type of tactic that any type of group might engage in. Furthermore, this identity came to be associated with its own explanation. Terrorists are evil, irrational actors whose action is driven not by normal interests or political motives, but instead by their very nature as terrorists. So I argue that in order to understand how political violence came to be understood as terrorism, we have to look at a combination of things, a combination of changes in the way that political violence was used, an identification of events as a new type of problem, and the creation of a body of knowledge about this new problem. I suggest that a crucial transformation in how we understand political violence occurred in the 1970s. It was at this time that the discourse of terrorism, as we now know it, took shape. And it was then that this discourse emerged in concert with a new field of terrorism expertise. The types of incidents that we now understand as terrorism were previously governed through a discourse of insurgency. And I argue that the shift from insurgency to terrorism as a framework of understanding has had significant effects for the production of terrorism knowledge and terrorism expertise. A crucial turning point dates back to the rise of a seemingly new sort of political theatrical violence in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was exemplified by the media-centric hijackings and hostage-takings perpetrated by Palestinian nationalist groups. While political violence against civilians was, of course, not new, what was new here was that nationalist and anti-colonial violence began to transgress national boundaries in new ways, targeting Americans and other Westerners at international sites, such as air travel, and in an incident that would come to be seen as a seminal trigger for the U.S. concern with terrorism, the Olympic Games. Part of what distinguishes the category of terrorism is that it is seen as violence out of place. Now, of course, this begs the question of where violence does belong. But what we can induce from how the category of terrorism is applied in practice is that the category resonates most when violence strikes those places and those people who are considered to have a right to be safe or immune or innocent. Attacks on Europe, on the West, on the cosmopolitan metropole, while it is seen as less apt to apply when violence occurs in places where it is somehow expected, in war zones, in colonial and post-colonial areas, in the non-West. And we can see this, for example, in the disproportionate responses to attacks in different locations. On September 5th, 1972, 8 members of the Black September organization entered the dormitory of the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, killing 2, taking 9 others hostage. They demanded the release of 236 Palestinians who'd been imprisoned in Israel, as well as members of the Red Army faction imprisoned in Germany. The crisis reverberated around the world. It was broadcast live to an audience estimated at 900 million television viewers around the world by the global media that had gathered, of course, for the Olympic Games. Now, while this event was an important turning point, the event alone did not immediately or transparently lead to changes in discourse. Rather, transformations occur through a combination of events and subsequent struggles over how they should be defined and over who has the authority to do this defining. So in the case of Munich, while some called the attacks terrorism right away, it was not yet clear exactly what terrorism entailed or whether terrorism was indeed the proper framework for making sense of these events. As you can see here, the language used by world leaders to describe the attacks was not necessarily that of terrorism. The New York Times would write that yesterday's murderous assault in Munich plumbed new depths of criminality. World leaders condemned the attacks as insane terror, an insane assault, an abhorrent crime, and the work of sick minds who do not belong to humanity. In the US, President Nixon condemned outlaws who will stop at nothing to accomplish goals. The Olympic attacks spurred the American government to take action in ways that earlier hijackings and hostage takings had not, identifying international terrorism as a problem newly in need of a solution. Shortly after the events at Munich, President Nixon established the first official U.S. government body devoted to the problem, the Cabinet Committee to Combat Terrorism. Together with the State Department, the Cabinet Committee began to call conferences and experts into being in search of a solution. By 1976, the State Department's Office of External Research was managing a budget of $250,000 of research and analysis on the subject. Within the space of a few years, terrorism was transformed from a topic with almost nothing written on it to a problem around which entire institutes, journals, and conferences were organized. By 1977, at least 11 bibliographic catalogs had been compiled to keep track of the ever-increasing number of publications. A few years later, one observer would write, "Authors have spilled almost as much ink as the actors of terrorism have spilled blood." What you see here on this slide is just a rough measure of this, right? So this is compiled from the Google Ngram viewer, which looks at mentions of words in English language books that they have electronically uploaded. So it's not a perfect measure, but it can give you a rough sense of what terms were being used at different times in relation to one another. And what you see here is, right, the red line is mentions of insurgency, counterinsurgency related terms. The blue line is mentions of terrorism, counterterrorism, and related terms, right? And you see, right, sort of that in 1972, first of all, right, sort of the blue line, references to terrorism surpasses the red line, and it overtakes it, right? Sort of with 1972 being a very clear break, and then you have some later increases as well. The overall numbers are very low because this is in comparison to all of the different words that are used in the database. But, it's just to show you that sort of there is that shift there at that specific moment in time. Another indicator of the rapid growth of terrorism expertise is the spread of conferences on the subject. The first American conference on terrorism was held in 1972. By 1978, 29 conferences had been held with a total of 436 presenters. Moreover, this was not just a quantitative increase, but also, I argue, the growth of a set of relationships among those who were taking on a new identity, that of the terrorism expert. By the late 1970s, a networked group of terrorism scholars had emerged, sometimes calling themselves, not without a touch of irony, the terrorism mafia. I'm now going to shift to the question of how terrorism took on the particular set of meanings that it did, and I'll do this by highlighting the comparison to one of the alternate approaches to the problematization of political violence that it displaced. As I've said, right, sort of before the discourse of terrorism crystallized, political violence, including bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations, was often understood instead through the framework of insurgency. Although the events they deal with appear similar, the discourses of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism differ in their conceptualizations of the problem, of its causes, and the potential responses they suggest. While the counterinsurgency discourse tended to conceptualize insurgents and counterinsurgents as parallel roles, the discourse on terrorism would come to be characterized by an ongoing tension over whether or not terrorists were necessarily evil, pathological, irrational actors, fundamentally different from us. Counterinsurgent writers and fighters frequently expressed a degree of respect for their opponents that would be quite unusual in the terrorism literature. So, for example, as the preface to one of the classic works of modern counterinsurgency, Roger Trinquear's Modern Warfare, put it, the author approaches the insurgents with the cold respect of a professional warrior. He describes an enemy who is deeply committed to his cause and ingenious in its pursuit. Within the counterinsurgency discourse, terror was viewed as but one stage in a broader process of insurgency or revolution, a stage through which groups could pass without permanently tainting their reputations as terrorists. This view of terror as a tactic, rather than as an identifying feature of individuals or groups, also meant that the counterinsurgency literature was more likely to approach terrorism as something that could be used by either insurgents or states. This approach is well illustrated by the report from a symposium on counterinsurgency held at RAND, a US government-funded think tank, in 1962. At this event, participants spoke of the possibility of using terror wisely and selectively. The report from this conference begins by discussing structural problems that may lead guerrilla movements in different parts of the world to use violence, problems such as unemployment, inequality, and colonialism, and in fact, an acknowledgement of the importance of a cause to insurgents and guerrillas was almost universal in this literature. As Julian Paget put it in 1967, the first requirement of a successful insurgency is a cause to fight for. This emphasis on the role of motivations and grievances in the counterinsurgency literature imposed on experts in the field the importance of understanding insurgents' minds, their mentality, and their motives. Aspects of this insurgency framework, in which terror was seen as more of a tactic than a defining act, carried over into the earliest expert analyses of terrorism in the 1970s. At the very first American Conference on Terrorism, held in 1972 at the State Department, there was a general consensus that nearly every variety of political and ethnic group is likely, under certain generally desperate circumstances, to resort to terrorism. That terrorism is a tool not confined to opposition forces, it can also be applied by established regimes, and that terrorism was the product of frustration induced by unresolved grievances. Similarly, a 1974 US government report noted, the US government recognizes the merit of elimination of causes of terrorism, including legitimate grievances which motivate potential terrorists. By the mid-1970s, however, discussions of terrorism had begun to move away from this counterinsurgency framework and towards a reconceptualization of terrorism as a new type of practice that defined a certain type of actor, the terrorist. And so I looked to the report from a follow-up conference held at the State Department just 4 years later, in 1976, who agreed that terrorism was the activity of sub-state actors, who doubted that the direct causes of terrorism could be discovered in political or socioeconomic conditions, and who were skeptical of the argument that the way to stop terrorism was to remove its causes. At this conference, the question of whether or not terrorists could ever be freedom fighters was hotly debated, with the majority of the presenters arguing that the categories were mutually exclusive. And I see this as an important moment because this opposition between terrorists and freedom fighters is seen as something of a cliche today, right? There's the cliche, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But here's the thing, right? Sort of what makes that a cliche? What makes that obvious? What makes it obvious is that there is an underlying understanding that these are two mutually opposed categories. Either a group are terrorists or they're freedom fighters, right? Terrorists, bad, freedom fighters, good. And you can't be both. And of course, there's disagreement over how to classify any particular organization. And this is the everlasting problem of definition, right? Sort of which Professor Schmid spoke about. But the problem is, right, we want to categorize a group as one or the other. To suggest that it could be both is nonsensical. Yet, if we look at these progression in these two conferences, at the 1972 conference, this was not necessarily seen as a problem. There was agreement that, of course, it's possible to be a terrorist and a freedom fighter. Whereas by 1976, this becomes a site of harsh contestation, with most of the people there arguing that the categories are mutually exclusive. The contrast, therefore, between the discussion at this second State Department conference and the first one is striking. The introduction to another conference held in 1976 stated that terrorism was a new barbarism, fought primarily not to win territory or even to cause destruction, but to command attention, to instill fear and to terrorize, in the hope of forcing the world to listen and to right an alleged wrong. And by the late 1970s, this conceptualization of terrorists as evil, irrational, or pathological had become firmly entrenched. Now, this is not to say that everyone producing knowledge about terrorism at that time accepted those constraints. But if they disagreed with them, they had to explicitly disagree and fight back against these assumptions which were now prevalent in the political discourse about the problem. As terrorism solidified, therefore, into an object of knowledge, it did not become purified of its moral or political character, as we often assume it might be the case in science or social science. Instead, the discourse became even more characterized by an intertwining of moral, political, and scientific concerns, leading to persistent difficulties for those who sought to treat political violence as an object of rational scientific analysis. Experts have often attempted to strip the term of its judgmental connotations, right, with the ongoing search for a depoliticized definition, for a neutral definition, for a definition that could be accepted by, right, opposing sides. That was the holy grail. But yet, this search, sort of has been consistently, difficult, and it's not been settled. The ongoing problem of definition, right? We're still speaking about that today. Even insofar as experts have attempted to strip the term of its judgmental connotations to turn it into something more objective, these strategies have been of limited success. I've argued that terrorism took shape as a problem that contained within it its own explanation. Terrorists are evil, and that is why they commit terrorism. Consequently, any broader attempt to explain political violence in other terms could potentially be dismissed as both pointless and morally suspect. This construction of terrorism as inherently evil constrained those who would speak out as experts. In order to maintain credibility and authority, experts often needed to maintain a certain distance from their very object of expertise. And this made certain forms of knowledge come to seem almost taboo. Attempts to explain can be taken as justification. Attempts to understand can be elided with sympathy. Groups of experts would continue to try to resist these pressures, trying to establish terrorism studies as something more like a normal, values-neutral scientific discipline, but these attempts have met continued resistance, emblematized by the continuing problem of definition. Neither experts, nor politicians, nor the lay public have been able to come to an agreement on how to define terrorism. As Brian Jenkins, the founding head of terrorism research at RAND, told me in an interview, definitional debates are the great Bermuda Triangle of terrorism research. I've seen entire conferences go off into definitional debates, never to be heard from again. So hopefully that won't happen to us today. My co-panelist Alex Schmid, in his foundational 1988 survey of the literature, found more than 100 different definitions in use. An observer at a mid-1980s Department of Defense symposium reported there were almost as many definitions as there were speakers, and a 2001 article described a perverse situation where a great number of scholars are studying a phenomenon, the essence of which they have by now simply agreed to disagree upon. So my talk so far has focused on the past of terrorism studies, right? How did the field, as it exists today, come to be? But following on the title of the symposium, I also want to ask a bit about what are the implications of this history for the past, the present, and the future study of terrorism. And I would suggest that many of the main critiques of terrorism and terrorism studies have their roots in this history. So for example, right, the problem of definition. Critics continually point out that there are moral and political biases in the applications of the label. And they're not wrong, right? It's hard to deny that in popular and political discourse, terrorist has racial and religious meanings that are hardly subtle enough to even call a subtext. Almost as common are critiques of the exclusion of state terror from both popular and scholarly discourse on terrorism, along with a disproportionate focus on non-state terror and on violence that targets the West. And I would suggest that many of these problems, right, sort of when it comes down to these critiques of terrorism studies, come down to the question of what we can call autonomy or the lack thereof. The question of, is the field too dependent upon the state, right? As I've discussed, the autonomy of the field is indeed limited. It's limited in its ability to stabilize the definition of terrorism. It's limited in the ability to push back on the demonization of terrorists as simply evil and not subject to rational explanation. And it's limited in the ability of experts to draw boundaries around the production of knowledge or the designation of experts, wherein we have a situation where individuals are sometimes anointed as such by states or media outlets, even when they're widely seen as lacking credibility in the academic field. A key question, therefore, in studies of terrorism expertise is whether experts have autonomy or whether they primarily mirror the interests of states and other political actors. If is the case, as some have suggested, that terrorism expertise is primarily a smokescreen for reproducing the views of states, then it would make little sense to devote further attention to the expert field rather than the field of state power itself. If, however, on the other hand, as I have argued, experts do have autonomy, albeit a limited and contested degree of it, the question of how and when expertise is shaped becomes ever more crucial. So I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts. I'll take the liberty of presenting some of my thoughts on what the future of terrorism studies should or could look like if, like me, you see the autonomy of scholarship from the state as desirable. And recognizing that some of these are things being taken up by researchers here and elsewhere, I would advocate for first rethinking what terrorism is and how it is conceptualized by those who research and teach about it. We might consider, should we include state violence, structural violence, or organized campaigns of terror waged against political, racial, or ethnic groups, whether these are perpetrated by the state or non-state actors, in our analysis. We should take autonomy seriously, which means at the very least that authors must always critically evaluate state designations of groups as terrorist and never take state definitions or descriptions of activities as countering terrorism at face value. We should desensationalize terrorism and think about perhaps reinserting it within the broader framework of political violence. And finally, I would argue for focusing as much on actions and the harms resulting from those actions taken in the name of counterterrorism as upon terrorism itself. Thank you.
Thanks very much to both Alex and Lisa for two excellent papers, and thanks, Tim, for the opportunity to speak on this panel. It's wonderful even just to sit here with three excellent scholars whose work I very much admire and have relied upon in my own studies. And so what I intend to do, the great thing about being an academic is that sometimes you get to come up with as many problems as you do solutions. And so I intend, I suppose, to ask some questions that you can choose to see as rhetorical, or they can be kind of food for thought. So don't feel that you need to respond directly to them. They can merely stimulate wider debate and discussion. And I'll take each of the papers in turn, though some of the issues will cut across both Alex and Lisa's work. Alex, I didn't think that you were worried that you were going to be boring. I don't think that's the case. I think your work is rigorous and comprehensive, meticulous always, and I think that's what you were this morning. Once again, it's your hallmark, I think. And as I read through your paper in advance of this, I had a few thoughts. I wonder how much terrorism as a concept is different from other contentious concepts in the social sciences. And this is something I ask students of mine when we study terrorism and counterterrorism. How different is it? So I do take your points about the kind of things which make terrorism wicked, as you put it in the paper, resistant to definition. So the confusion between terror and terrorism being one, the complexity and other, yes, but then other concepts in the social sciences are equally as complex. Things like ethnic cleansing, genocide, nationalism, what is democracy, these kind of things. And how many of those command consensus, and does it really stand as a challenge to our knowledge or understanding of those areas? Terrorism likewise might have multiple targets and multiple audiences, but then it seems to me that most social or political actions do to some degree. If the state convicts someone of a crime, then they're punishing that individual, they're offering some sort of consolation or solace to any direct victims of that crime. They're demonstrating to society that the state still has the power and control within society, and they're trying to discourage or dissuade others from engaging in it. So as social action goes, or political action goes, there's often a number of messages happening at any one time to a number of audiences, and it seems that terrorism is kind of just another example of those. You mentioned right at the start that you were here 5 years ago for the 20th anniversary, and I had the pleasure to listen to you speak then as well. And so I just wondered what you thought. Are we closer or further away from a consensus on a definition of terrorism than we were 5 years ago? Because it seems to me from your paper that you talked about the massive proliferation of literature on the topic, the extensive range of definers, people who get to contribute definitions, following their own logic and objectives, which now includes groups like Facebook. It seems that these are kind of add to the complexity of things. That there are more stakeholders with a say in definitions than perhaps there were, certainly 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So how does that affect our quest for a consensus definition? On Facebook and social media, I think is very interesting. They have 350 experts, 15,000 screeners searching for this terrorist content. They have their own definition of terrorism, of course. But I think as well we have to recognize the deficiency of social media. One of the reasons that Facebook and other social media outlets have come in for such intense criticism in the past number of years is because they've been unable to keep terrorist content or content which has been labelled terrorist out of the public eye, away from their users and off their services. And so maybe we need to think a bit more about the complex ways in which social media can affect the public understanding of terrorism and political violence. Thinking then about distractions from the quest for a definition of terrorism or from thinking about terrorism in particular. You made a point elsewhere in one of your articles that I read about the focus on radicalization and how this has shifted attention perhaps away from societal level explanations of terrorism, where states might be interested and academics might be interested in looking at structural factors, root causes, inequalities, deficiencies in the political system, this kind of thing, and might be moving towards or have moved towards a level of analysis where we're looking at the individual, the terrorist, and seeing what their problem is as opposed to what our problems are. And this, Lisa, I think pertains to your stuff as well, to your paper. And you mentioned violent extremism, and that seems to me to be doing some of the same legwork in recalibrating how we think about terrorism, and I wondered how productive or destructive that might be. I also thought something that you didn't mention, but another term which we can think of here, domestic extremism, which has come up particularly in the United States, and what that implies. There's a number of implications as far as I can see from a shift towards splitting out terrorism from domestic extremism, and what that says about the nature of terrorism and whose problem it is and how we should deal with it. And what happens if we go with the flow and accept this proliferation of labels, which as academics that are sometimes put on to us or generated by the state or public discourse, and what our role should be in navigating through the sea of definitions of concepts. And I think the last thing I wanted to really bring up is a kind of a question with no answer, I suppose, but to ask about the utility of terrorism as a concept itself. Because it seems to me that in one way, I totally agree, you're absolutely right, the number of different categories and types of terrorism that we see makes it very difficult to say anything of value about terrorism in general, because we have to dig down and understand the different kinds of terrorism and what motivates and the different kind of dynamics within each of these forms of terrorism. But in another level, something which you raised in your paper, terrorism is one form of political violence which overlaps with others, and so in some ways it isn't a wide enough, it doesn't offer us a wide enough view of things. And so is terrorism kind of stuck in the middle? It's not fine-grained enough to give us the detail, it's not wide-angled enough in order to be able to say anything of value broadly. Lisa, I really enjoyed your paper. I've been fascinated by your work since I read Disciplining Terror, and again I'm struck by the tremendous amount of legwork that there must have been to excavate the emergence of terrorism and terrorism studies, and given that so much of that was based on interviews with some very busy people at who've been in the field for such a long time. I think that's really a tremendous achievement. And one of the the fantastic things and really interesting things about working in CSTPV, and there are many, is that amongst our offices are lots of books belonging to Paul Wilkinson and some of his contemporaries right at the very start, and even from those precursor organizations that the principal mentioned this morning. And if you were to take all of these out and line them up, you would see exactly what you've described today, which is this shift in terminology from a discussion of insurgency and counterinsurgency, and one which looked at small wars and which framed the issue in those terms, to through the kind of 1980s and early 1990s, where you start to see terrorism become the dominant lens through which we view these things, or which these things were being viewed. So I thought that was really interesting. And, you know, having spent 5 minutes telling Alex that I think there's no emerging consensus, or that an emerging consensus is very difficult, I thought it was really interesting to see just how that consensus did emerge in your work, and how this kind of, okay, it didn't become fixed, or it didn't become very neatly defined, but there was a kind of emerging push towards understanding terrorism as always deplorable and dastardly violence by non-state actors, something which was totally reprehensible, and you know, as a label, something which seldom was applied to non-state violence. And so perhaps the consensus is settling, perhaps that conceptually speaking, as academics wanting a particular level of detail, some aspects of what that consensus is, or how we think of terrorism, are just unsettling, because we don't have the precision that we would like it to have. You know, you talked of anti-knowledge, and I think this relates back into some of these points and some of the stuff I said in response to Alex's paper as well. You know, Alan Dershowitz being one of the kind of clearest examples of someone who's been fantastically wrong in many ways when it comes to terrorism, in my view. You know, but saying that we shouldn't try to dig in and understand terrorism because that concedes something to the terrorist. And I think that perhaps in setting the kind of agenda where we look at the personal motivations, or we look at the individual level factors which drive people towards terrorism, perhaps that also is an exercise in anti-knowledge of a sort, because it keeps us away from particular kinds of you know, the production of some kind of other knowledge that would help us explain terrorism in a wider sense. And, you know, right at the very end, you talked about what needs to happen to the field of terrorism if we're to move forward and be more productive going forward. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how we can achieve that together, you know, as academics. If we can achieve that, given that academics are but one stakeholder in a very large and ongoing conversation on what terrorism is and how we should think of it. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for all your questions. It will take me 3 hours to answer them. In my written text, which I summarized, there were other things, including a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, "Everything that has a history cannot be defined." And in the 220 years since Gracchus Babeuf came up with the term terrorists as opposed to terror. Terror was the order of the day by the National Convention and legal in those revolutionary times. Terrorism wasn't. So the meanings have shifted, as Lisa said. But of course that's also true with other terms. And if you have defined a term in international law, for instance, like genocide, there's a genocide convention, which came into effect only 4 years after Limburg came up with the term in 1944. December 1948, there was a genocide convention. We have that convention. Has it stopped genocide? No. For instance, Stalin insisted the class war could never be genocide. So the political reason. Ethnic cleansing, yes, but not political, was not included. And when we look at other terms, I mean, war has been defined since Thucydides and Clausewitz, but it's constantly changing. And the fact that we have now a definition of aggression since a couple of years has not stopped aggression, because we have proxy wars, hybrid wars, mercenaries, all sort of things. So all these things can go around the problem. Perhaps some key terms in international relations are absolutely undefined. The nation is not defined. We have a definition of the state, that's a people, a government, a territory, and a recognition of other such entities as a state. That's a state. But we don't know what a nation is. So it's a black hole in international relations. And people is absolutely undefined. We, the people, who are the people? Is it the population? Is it everybody on a territory? What is self-determination? Who is the self that determines? So we have a number of black holes in IR. And it's useful to fill these terms, but it's incredibly different. I was for a number of years involved, on the side only, in what became the Palermo Convention against organized crime. It was years of deliberation. What is organized crime? We could not define it to the agreement of everybody. So we defined only the organized criminal group, and that went into the Palermo Convention. The Merida Convention, which came 3 years later on corruption, did not define corruption at all, because the US Congress mainly objected to any definition, because all the sort of lobbying that was going on cannot possibly be called corruption. So yes, these terms all have their history, and but on some things we agree. For instance, piracy is internationally condemned. Nobody loves pirate except Peter Lair, because he lives from piracy. Among other things, I don't know how his royalties are, hopefully better than mine. Slavery, we all object to, but these days there are more slaves in the world, domestic servants in the Middle East, than there were probably at the time of slavery. And our historical perspective is also very limited. Slavery, these were the people shipped by white people from Liverpool and other places to the Americas, but they were caught by black Africans, catching other black Africans. More slaves were brought to the Middle East than to the West, but since they were castrated, we don't see a trace of them. So if you go into the history of all these things, it's full of darkness. One question that was raised is, when is a terrorist group or a terrorist group? ANC committed little terrorism, perhaps 5% of its total actions. Most of them were demonstrations, some of it was guerrilla warfare. But when does an organization legitimately be called terrorist? Whether it commits only terrorism, half terrorism, or only 1% terrorism? So these are all questions that are open. Yeah, we heard that terrorism is part of political violence, but if you ask what is political, that's opening another kind of words. Everything a politician drags out of the social events and puts into parliament or mentions in the media can be politicized and become political. So defining terrorism as political violence creates problems there. And what is violence? It goes all the way from a nuclear holocaust to domestic violence and pub brawl. So these terms all have their flexibility. And while it's important to have definitions, definitions themselves do not solve the problem. One thing that I would like to underline that's what Lisa said in her last PowerPoint, and where terrorism study has fallen short. I often compare terrorism to a game of tennis. There's a court with two players, but we focus much too much on what's happening on one side of the court without looking what the counter-terrorists do. And it's action and co-action. And if there's one thing that is understudied in terrorism and triggering terror, is the role of revenge. It is something that comes up again and again in the literature of the terrorists themselves, but in the scientific literature on terrorism, there are very few studies on revenge. At least they have not come to my notice. Well, I will leave my answer to these few remarks and leave it to Lisa to fill the void.
Okay. Yeah, so very briefly, thank you for those comments. Let's see. On anti-knowledge, I think you're absolutely right. I've sometimes come to regret using that term because people hear it and think it means that we don't know anything or we can't know anything, and really it means much more like what you said, right? Sort of it's about focusing our attention on some aspects, right? So for example, focusing on individual motivations and taking, sort of redirecting our gaze away from other things. On sort of the question of how can the field become more focused, or sort of how do we think about sort of the fact that terrorism studies exist, right, sort of not unto itself, but within this broader arena of so many other people and states and actors who are attempting to think and understand and redefine terrorism, and I think that's the key. I don't have the answer, as, sort of one thing I think, as I've said, this is not original, sort of this is a thing that's been ongoing in the field, but I would say, sort of it is important to try to maintain, right, sort of the, sort of if you think it's important to have scholarly study of terrorism, right, to maintain that as something that has a degree of independence, right, sort of to fix your gaze on, right, sort of what are we doing as scholarly researchers rather than, sort of accepting the redefinitions and sort of changes in how to understand terrorism that are continually being, sort of developed and sort of reimposed into the scholarly field from elsewhere. The other thing I might say is, to suggest that it would be useful to have more focus on how terrorism is defined and understood and acted upon, right, sort of in other arenas. So I'm fascinated, right, for example, by the case of Facebook, right, sort of, and I had no idea. I knew that they had, sort of employees and screeners who were, attempting to screen permissible from impermissible content. I had no idea that it was 350 experts and tens of thousands of screeners. That's amazing, and that's fascinating. Is someone studying that, right? Is someone studying how those decisions get made in practice? How do those screeners decide what counts as terrorism and what doesn't? That's a really important site for thinking about how, right, sort of Facebook, which is one of the main categories of distribution of news and information in the world today, is able to impose certain definitions and categories out there that, most people are probably not aware of that happening because it's happening behind the scenes, or they may be aware that it occurs, but not how the decisions get made. And that's just one site, right, sort of where these distinctions and definitions happen. That's not, right, sort of the site of terrorism studies where we can, sort of try to be transparent and open about how we're defining things and debate with each other. And yet in some ways, right, sort of has more impact. So I would say, look to those sites. I want to see, is someone studying that? Or if not, go to it.